Representative Emanuel Cleaver is a person who is frankly a joy to encounter around the halls of this institution. There are some people who read their religious scripture. There are others who live it. And Representative Cleaver is someone who, in any small interaction, 2 o'clock in the morning during late votes, if you encounter him, there's a warmth, there's a glow. I think there's a godliness about the way he conducts himself, which makes him an asset to this institution, not simply as a lawmaker, but as a human being. And Representative, we're glad to welcome you here with us this morning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize. I've been in a little struggle for the last week. I'd like to thank you and thank you, Member Klein, for holding this hearing. And I think this hearing is extremely important because this may be the first of many discussions in the 110th Congress on the status or perceived status of an individual's sexual orientation and their right to employment. And I look forward to both bodies and both parties in Congress working together to help strengthen and expand the Civil Rights Act of 1964 so that our nation can further empower and engage the patchwork of all Americans in every community toward achieving full participation in every sphere of life in our nation. Simply put, Mr. Chairman, we're talking about jobs and an individual's right to work. The measure we are examining here today, H.R. 2015, the Employment Non Discrimination Act of 2007, known as EDNA, would strengthen the legal right for all individuals and allow them to be assessed on their ability to do a job because of their skill set and not a set of prejudices. Most of the arguments against this measure, as I have listened to religious radio, which my wife thinks that it's an act of self-torture, but nonetheless, I do listen almost on a daily basis, and I hear the arguments against this measure, and they usually take the form of some kind of an attack on family values, and that somehow protecting those who are or are perceived to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender from equal legal consideration for employment is an affront to family, and somehow specifically their family. In all the discussions I've heard on this subject, no one has yet explained how keeping someone from gaining equal consideration based on their individual skill set to obtain lawful employment pleases God. How can an American who claims to embrace God and uses that theology to then discriminate against another individual? Before I was elected to Congress, I very happily, and I might add, considered my only full-time job, even when I served as mayor of Kansas City, to being the pastor of the St. James United Methodist Church. And against all odds and against the Wesleyan tradition, I've held this appointment for 30 years. The average tenure of a Methodist pastor in our country is 3 years. However, I have 2 full-time jobs. I still remain the unpaid senior pastor of St. James, while I serve as the representative from Missouri's 5th Congressional District. The role as pastor will never leave me, and I will never leave it. I'm compelled to go home each weekend, and I generally preach and teach and visit hospitals, and I counsel all people who come to me. And I have never been able to get over the fact that when a parishioner comes to me and expresses discrimination he or she has felt based on their sexual orientation, how I could then say, in the name of God, I'm sorry, I cannot be supportive. I have theological difficulty in doing that. And I say here now, with absolute conviction and confidence, that an individual's sexual orientation has nothing, absolutely no connection with my God's interpretation of my need to minister to them. Three of the greatest sins, I believe, are indifference to, neglect of, and disrespect for God's other sheep. I will not delve too deeply into the political, ecclesiastical details of my position on those questions. Suffice it to say, none of the world's major religions, and certainly not the three monotheistic religions, believe that God endorses discrimination based on sexual orientation. The opponents of this legislation, at least the ones on radio, argue that homosexuality and transgender identity are unnatural, immoral, or that someone else's sexual orientation offends their religious senses. Let there be no doubt, I am certainly pro-marriage. As an ordained United Methodist pastor, I performed more than 400 heterosexual weddings, and I have been happily and fortunately married to the same woman for 3 decades. Even the same woman who thinks that I am mentally ill for listening to the radio programs that condemn me. Nonetheless, those opposing the legislation, I believe, have their issues confused. We're not discussing whether a state should recognize an individual's right to marry. That was, is, and shall hopefully always be left to the wisdom of state legislatures around the country. Although it is much too often discussed in Congress, marriage is not a federal issue. Today we're trying to further extend the rights of individuals who've been marginalized and discriminated against and denied legal federal protection for an equal playing field in their own country. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I've watched over my lifetime a person who has almost the same name as me. His name is Gary Emanuel Cleaver. My first cousin. I've seen him with a college education move from job to job to job. Once he was discovered, or once people believed him to be homosexual, all of a sudden the pressures became too difficult for him to stay in that job. I never thought it was right when I didn't see Gary being mistreated. But when I watched someone with my same DNA, with a very healthy IQ, and with a very, very good work ethic, have difficulty staying on a job, I became more and more committed to this cause. Before I was mayor, I was the national vice president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This is the organization founded by Martin Luther King Jr. and 4 other mentors of mine, Joe Lowry, Fred Shuttlesworth, C.K. Steele, and Ralph David Abernathy. We realized, or they did, I was much younger and just following behind these giants, that the federal government was our friend. In fact, absent the actions of the federal government, I'm not sure what would be happening in our country today. The federal government took the lead in providing us with civil rights and with equal rights. And therefore, I was very pleased on July 26, 1990, when President George H.W. Bush signed one of the most groundbreaking civil rights laws of our nation's history, the Americans with Disability Act. No law since the Civil Rights Act of '64 has been as sweeping and as all-encompassing as the bill signed by former President Bush. And I think today are the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., because they still ring true. And he said, and I quote, "I refuse to accept the idea that the isness of man's present nature makes him morally incapable of reaching up for the oughtness that forever confronts him. This legislation ought to be approved. No matter where we are, we need to reach for the oughtness." In conclusion, let me just say, Mr. Chairman, I believe that all Americans deserve the right of equal protection under the law. Now is the time to guarantee all Americans the God-given right to be. Thank you.